Hello, my name is Nick Bell and this is intended to be a brief presentation as possible just to outline responsibilities that landlords have for Legionella in their rental properties. Okay, so what actually is Legionella? Well, it's a bacteria that is naturally found in water. The disease associated with Legionella is a pneumonia type illness that you catch by breathing in that bacteria. And you probably think to yourself, how on earth do I do that? Well, if you've ever seen that mist that you get from a jet wash, a shower head, a spray head anywhere in the home, if you breathe in that spray, that fine mist of water, and it's got the bacteria within and that gets into your lungs, that's how you can catch Legionnaire's disease. The bacteria itself is dormant at low and high temperatures, but most prevalent at 37 degrees, which is around body temperature. Given the right conditions, the right amount of time and in stored water, that's where the bacteria, the Legionella bacteria, can multiply within the water system. In terms of the highest risk groups, males particularly over the age of 50 who have a low immune system, perhaps are heavy drinkers or heavy smokers, and it can actually kill people as well. Okay, so in terms of the boring bits now, all the actual legislation incorporates the ACOP, the Approved Code of Practice, L8, that's been about since 1991. It does also incorporate with the Health and Safety at Work Act 1974, COSH as well, Control of Substances Hazardous to Health 2002. Historically, it really mainly covered situations like care homes, schools and hospitals, particularly where there were vulnerable sectors of society, young people and particularly old people. In the past, the legislation, to be fair, was probably very ambiguous in terms of who it actually covered. It just talked about people in charge of buildings, and it wasn't until the 4th edition in 2013 where it specifically mentioned the word landlord and tenant and set out what a landlord's responsibility actually is. And believe it or not, it does have exactly the same legal status as a gas safety certificate. Okay, so in terms of why we have the actual legislation, and aside of the obvious to protect the greater society, water authorities no longer inspect plumbing work anymore. I don't believe that they've done that for a very, very long time. And probably as a result of that, standards within plumbing have slipped. There's lots of DIY installations going on, and with trade internationally, there are lots of products that people are using in properties that are probably not rated to BS standards. So therefore, as a result of all those things, properties are at a higher risk of Legionella. It is now a legal requirement, and ignorance is not an excuse, unfortunately. Okay, so before we get into the legislation itself, just thought I'd look at some basic terminology. There are two roles identified as part of the legislation. That is, firstly, the duty holder, and effectively in this situation, that is the landlord. It is their duty to adhere to the legislation. And secondly, a responsible person. So the duty holder can appoint a responsible person to take over the duty holder's responsibilities. That responsible person must be competent at what they do. If they're not, they can outsource that to an equally competent person. If the duty holder does not appoint a responsible person, then they become still the responsible person. Hopefully all that makes sense. Okay, so this is a really straightforward slide. This is effectively what the Health and Safety Executive says that landlords are responsible for doing. So landlords who provide residential accommodation as the person in control of the premises or responsible for the water systems in their premises have a legal duty to ensure that the risk of exposure of tenants to Legionella is properly assessed and controlled. This duty extends to residents, guests, tenants and customers. Okay, so what are landlords actually required to do, the nuts and bolts of it? There's three areas that they are responsible for. Firstly is to identify the risk. then minimise the risk, and latterly to manage the risk. So just to look at each of those individual aspects of the legislation. Identifying the risk is relatively straightforward, basically means undertaking a risk assessment, and I'll cover that in the next slide. Then minimise the risk. So the risk assessment will likely identify any areas within the hot and cold water system that requires upgrading in order that the risk for Legionella within the property is minimised. So the second aspect of that is to minimise the risk by carrying out any remedial works. And then thirdly, and the area that most landlords miss, unfortunately, is managing that risk, and it's probably one of the most important aspects of the landlord's responsibilities for Legionella. So that entails taking responsibility for Legionella. If the property is empty on a weekly basis, the property needs to be flushed. If the property is empty for extended periods of time, so if the property has had a renovation or has been empty for a long period of time prior to being occupied, it actually does need disinfecting before it can be occupied. The legislation also states that the risk assessment needs to be reviewed on a regular basis, doesn't give any timescales with that. Records must be kept of any work that's been done, so any flushing, disinfecting, any changes to the hot and cold water system. And another really important aspect to cover the landlord themselves is to ensure that the tenants are fully understood what their responsibilities are as occupiers within the property to minimise the risk for themselves. So in terms of what actually is a risk assessment, specific to Legionella, this is a detailed inspection of the entire hot and cold water system, and it starts right from the incoming main, so from the main stopcock, right through to all the outlets within the installation. The installation itself is checked to make sure that it is up to current regs. All the assets within the building are checked, so things like anything that heats the hot water, showers, hot water cylinders, tanks in loft, all those assets are checked individually as well. There is particular attention to where water is stored, so those cylinders and those tanks in lofts, because that's most prevalent where Legionella can actually grow. Any redundant pipework, because you've got water sat in a piece of pipework that doesn't actually go anywhere. It might be an old appliance connection that's been disconnected. That length of pipework would be classed as stored water, so we have to check those as well. And then ultimately we check the temperatures from all the outlets, so all the hot and cold outlets, the taps within a building, just to check that they are within specifications. So cold water needs to be below 20 degrees and hot water above 50 degrees. There is a general health and safety look at the installation as well, particularly things like hot water. Some cylinder stats either don't exist or they're turned up so much that hot water comes out at over 70 degrees, we found, which is obviously a very high risk. A score is then identified for each of the assets, which contributes to an overall score for the building itself. That risk assessment will identify remedial works that should reduce the risk of Legionella within the property. A copy of the risk assessment is kept on file, and any changes to the hot and cold water system, so if there's a new boiler, for example, installed, or new taps, then a record is kept on the risk assessment of any works that have been carried out. Just very briefly, I'm going to touch on some of the myths that encircle the industry. You do not need a risk assessment every 2 years. There's nothing in the legislation which states any timescales for carrying out new risk assessments. It does talk about regular reviews, however, it does not state that you need a new risk assessment every 2 years, and equally you do not need a new risk assessment every time a new tenant moves in. So as I say, it does need reviewing on a regular basis. It does not give a timescale for what those reviews are. Simply providing a risk assessment does not satisfy the landlord's legal responsibility for the legislation. There are other aspects to it which we've covered in a previous slide. And finally, there is no legal requirement for water testing within residential properties. Bacteria is in the water course, Legionella bacteria is in the water course, and you may well find Legionella. The risk assessment is there to identify what the risk is and minimise that risk. So the penultimate slide just sets out our offering to landlords in terms of satisfying their responsibilities. So the idea is that the duty holder, the landlord, appoints Sten Property to be the responsible person. So if you remember back to the slide about terminology, the responsible person effectively takes over all the legal responsibilities of the duty holder. So it's a legal appointment, and there is a different price for a 1 or 2 bed, different price for 3 bed, different price for a 4 bed, but that covers all aspects of the landlord's or the duty holder's responsibilities, excluding disinfecting and obviously remedial works, because it's an unknown quantity. So just line by line really, the appointment there of a responsible person, carry out any Legionella risk assessments that's required. So it might be, despite what we said earlier in the presentation, you don't need to redo a risk assessment, but if there's a significant change to the hot and cold water system, such as a new boiler, then it might be deemed that a new risk assessment is required. Any flushing that is required, so if the property is empty between tenancies for a period of time, on a weekly basis the property will be flushed. All stakeholders, so we're talking about the tenants, are ensured that they are made fully aware of their legal obligations and responsibilities to minimise the risk. Records are kept of any changes, any flushing that has been done within the property. That's good. A record is kept on the risk assessment itself. A regular review of the risk assessment is undertaken. Again, if you remember, the Health and Safety Executive does not stipulate what the timescale is on that. So we do an annual review. So once a year we go to the property and take temperatures of the hot and cold just to ensure that the risk assessment is still valid. We also do that at the start of each tenancy as well. This, we feel, offers maximum protection for the landlord and takes over their full legal responsibility. The only aspects, as I say, that aren't covered are any remedial works, which you will be provided a quote for, and also any disinfecting that is required after the property has been empty for a significant period of time. Okay, so final slide, you'll be pleased to hear, just detailing some links there to websites where you can find a bit further information. If you have any other questions, feel free to give us a call, 01636 642 850. I know there's a lot in there to take in, but if you do have any questions, please feel free to get in touch, and thank you for watching.